looks really kind of gross. It looks like a 3-day-old meatloaf. It's gray when you take it out of the head, and inside the head is bright red because of all the blood. In fact, it turns out, very surprisingly, that the source of our mental life, of our consciousness, is meat. In fact, you can eat it. People have eaten brains. I've had brain with cream sauce. Not human brain, mind you, but I've had brain with cream sauce. It's not bad. But it makes the puzzle all the more harder. How can this fleshy thing give rise to mental life? And that's the question I want to sort of explore in this lecture and the rest of the lectures. And I want to do so by starting with the smallest relevant parts, the living parts of neurons. Then explore how the neurons are connected together, how they're wired up, how they form different subparts of the brain, like the hypothalamus and the frontal lobe. And finally talking about the brain in a larger perspective, looking at the two halves of the brain, the left half and the right half, and how they interact. Now, there's a lot of stuff in the brain, a lot of chemical stuff, a lot of different parts. But where the action is, the part that does the thinking, the part that is the focus of most of our research, is the neurons. It's not an accident they call the study of the biological basis of thought neuroscience, because it all comes from the neurons. So you can see here pictures of neurons interacting together. And here's a diagram that depicts a typical neuron. So what you see is the dendrites, and dendrites receive signals from other neurons, either excitatory, like pluses, or inhibitory, minuses. And then they get to the cell body, which sums up these pluses and minuses. And when you reach a certain threshold, a certain amount of pluses, there's neural firing. And the firing takes place through the axon. The axon is much longer than the dendrites. In fact, for some motor neurons, it's very long indeed. There's axons running from your spinal cord all the way to your big toe. You think of it, of the relative sizes of things in terms of a basketball and a 14-mile garden hose. Surrounding the axon is what's called a myelin sheath. And a myelin sheath is, you can think of it as insulation, it's fatty tissue, like insulation on a wire. So the information comes through the dendrite, up in the cell body, and it's transmitted through the axon. So what neurons do is they sum up and transmit information. We know that there's a lot of them. By some estimates, it's 100 billion, or the estimates tend to be very different and very rough, but there's billions upon billions of neurons, and each connect to thousands, maybe tens of thousands of other neurons. And so the fact that you have something of this degree of complexity, this degree of structure which there's no way to replicate in any machine, the numbers are just too big, is why people might describe the brain as the most complicated machine in the universe. At least this is fitting. It's made of meat, maybe, which is kind of disappointing, but at least it shows this incredible internal structure. So neurons come in 3 flavors. There's sensory neurons, which take in information from the environment, from the external world. There's motor neurons, which go from the brain out to your motor control. So if you touch something hot, you feel the pain. That's sensory neurons. If you wrench your hand back or you reach for something, that's motor neurons. And finally, there's interneurons, which connect different neurons without making contact with the external world, either through sensation or through motor action. Now, the main thing to think about for neurons and neuron firing is that it's all or nothing. It's like firing a gun or sneezing. Neurons either fire or they don't. Now, you might think that's a little bit strange, particularly when you think about sensory neurons, because your experience seems to be a continuum. You have sensory neurons in your eyes, and you distinguish between a very dim light and a very bright light. You have sensory neurons in your fingers, and you can distinguish between gently touching something versus being stabbed on the tip of your finger with something. But still, the neurons are all or nothing. The way we get to this continuity of experience is that neurons can code for intensity in different ways. So one way is in terms of the number of neurons that fire. If X neurons neurons corresponds to a mild experience, X times 10 neurons might correspond to an intense experience. Another factor is the impulse frequency of individual neurons. So an individual neuron might denote a mild sensation by doing fire, 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 while it might denote an intense situation with fire, 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 fire. So you have neurons, and the neurons talk to each other. They talk to each other because an axon of one neuron will communicate with the dendrites of another neuron. And a long time ago, people used to think that neurons were wired up together like a computer. But in fact, neurons don't actually touch one another. There's a gap between the axon terminal of one neuron and the dendrite of another one. A very tiny gap, typically at like 1/10,000th of a meter wide. And this gap is known as a synapse. And when one neuron fires, the axon releases neurotransmitters. These are chemicals that shoot out over that gap and affect dendrites on other neurons. And as I said before, the effect of these neurotransmitters could be excitatory, which is that they raise the energy, so they increase the likelihood of a neuron firing, or inhibitory, so that they bring down the likelihood of a neuron firing. And what's interesting is that different neurons shoot out different neurotransmitters. And so they have different effects on the other neurons that they make contact with. And in fact, a lot of psychopharmacology, both attempts to cure various psychological or physical diseases by giving medicines, or recreational psychopharmacology designed to, increase pleasure of different forms, or sometimes help people work or help people focus, works by fiddling with the neurotransmitters. And these can be either antagonists that lower down the intensity of things by binding to the dendrites, making it hard to create more neurotransmitters, or they can increase the amount of neurotransmitters available in different ways, agonists. So you're either sort of pumping up the volume or turning down the volume. So you think about different drugs and their effects. There's curare. Curare is a drug used by South American Indians. It's an antagonist. It blocks motor neurons from affecting their muscle fibers. It keeps your motor neurons from working. And what it does is it paralyzes you. And in large enough doses, it kills you, because motor neurons also keep your heart beating. So shut that down and you die. There's alcohol. Now, alcohol also has an inhibitory effect. You might think that's strange, because when I drink alcohol, I get all excited and happy and goofy. And you have to keep this in mind here, the way alcohol works is it inhibits part of your brain that does the inhibition. So you have part of your brain that says, don't say that to the other person, keep your pants on, stop yelling. And alcohol basically inhibits that part of the brain, making you more exuberant. Then, over the course of things, in the course of drinking too much, it also inhibits other parts of the brain, so you could pass out and fall on the floor in large enough doses and die. So both curare and alcohol in different ways bring things down. Other drugs bring things up. So amphetamines, for instance, increase the amount of norepinephrine, which is another neurotransmitter. That's responsible for general arousal. And this is how drugs like speed or cocaine work. Other drugs like Prozac or L-Dopa influence neurotransmitters in ways that they increase, for instance, the supply of dopamine or serotonin, which can be relevant for issues like Parkinson's, which seems to be related to too little dopamine, and depression, which is related to too little serotonin. So these drugs work by influencing neurotransmitters either by directly pumping in more neurotransmitters, or increasing the supply in different ways, or stopping them from having effects by binding them, or making it, or sucking them up in different ways. But they work through their effects on neurotransmitters. So the more general idea is the way neurons lead to thinking is that they form clusters or networks. And these clusters and networks are computational devices that do interesting things, like recognizing faces, or walking left, right, or understanding sentences, or doing math, experiencing great sadness, or falling in love, and so on. And we now know that that's possible because we create computing machines that work in certain ways. And if you wire a computing machine in certain complicated ways, it can do mathematics, play chess, do flight simulator, and so on. And so you may be interested in a project of computational neuroscience which tries to ask the question, how are neurons wired up to do interesting things, and uses our own success at computational theory as a model, and then sometimes takes the inference the other way around, which is you can see how people do it, and then use this knowledge of how people do it to create computational systems that can do it as well. So how is the brain wired up? Well, you might imagine that it's wired up like a portable computer, like a laptop, like the sort of computer you're looking at now. In some regards it is, but there's a couple of reasons why it can't be. And both of them have to do with how well the brain works. So first, the brain is highly resistant to damage. If you get a knife to the brain, if you get damage to the brain, it won't typically shut down the whole system. The information and capacity is somehow distributed across neurons in such a way that makes them extremely resilient to damage. While in contrast, someone could open up the back of your laptop, pull out the chip, and the whole thing is ruined. The whole thing will stop working. But the brain is wired up in a certain way that makes it highly resilient. The second thing is the brain is wired up in such a way that it makes it work very fast. So computers can do millions of operations per second because they're purely electrical. But brain tissue is much slower and can't spend the time to do many steps. So to put it a different way, if your brain was wired up like a computer, it would be so slow as to be entirely unusable. It has to be wired up in a way that's more efficient, that allows for the slowness of brain tissues and neurotransmitters, and can still compute things at a human level, which is often blindingly fast. Because of this, there's been a huge interest in massively parallel systems and complicated neural networks which are wired up as we believe the brain does. And as such, we're helping computers to do things based on their understanding of the brain that they could never do before. And the details of this is something we're going to talk about through the course. We're not actually going to end up explaining different capacities directly in terms of neurons, because we can't, and because we wanted to have higher level explanations. So when I talk about how people learn language, or how they recognize faces, we're not going to talk much about neurons in particular, but we will talk about different brain areas and how they work. And then the assumption is, the bet is, that everything we talk about in more functional ways can ultimately reduce down to large networks of neural systems, and that in turn will ultimately reduce down to the specific behaviors of the specific neurons that we're looking at. So let's talk about the different parts of the brain and what they do. Parts of the brain are functionalized for different purposes. They do different things, which is why damage to different parts of the brain has different effects. It's why when you look at an fMRI scan or a PET scan or some sort of something that records neural activity, you could figure out based on the location of the activity what's going on. So the first thing to realize is I'm talking about the brain, but I'd be more precise and more inclusive if I talked about the brain in parts of the spinal cord. So you don't need your brain for everything. There's certain activities we do that can happen without a brain, like sucking in newborn, pulling your limb back to withdraw from pain or vomiting. But for everything else we talk about in this course, we really will be talking about the brain. So some of the structures of the brain that are highly relevant are called subcortical which means they're below the cortex, which means they're sort of in the center of the brain. And this includes part of the brain like the medulla, which controls certain automatic function like your heart rate, your blood pressure, swallowing, and so on. It includes the cerebellum, which is involved in body balance and muscle coordination. It contains about 30 billion neurons, so this isn't small potatoes. The hypothalamus, which is involved in feeding and sex and thirst and different appetites. A lot of the, sort of when we talk about emotions or visceral desires, we'll return to those parts of the brain. But for the aspects of psychology that are distinctive for us, that make us human, we're mostly focused on the outer layer, the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex, it is all crumpled up. If you were to take a brain, pull out the cortex, and straighten it out, like you're removing a rug you got from your trunk of your car and you have to straighten it out, it's about 2 feet square. So it's a lot of crumpling to get it in. It's about 3 millimeters thick. And this is where the action is. This is where, at least for the sort of things I'm interested in, this is where it takes place. It's where reasoning and language and complex perception comes from. Fish don't have any cerebral cortex, reptiles and birds have a little bit, but primates, including humans, have a lot. And when you look at the cortex, you'll see it has 2 halves. It has a left half and a right half. And for each of these halves, when you look at it, you can demarcate the brain, the cortex, into different lobes. There's going from sort of your forehead and swooping to the back. You have the frontal lobe, conveniently enough in front, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. In each of these lobes, there's different things, which we'll talk about in a bit. Another thing about the cortex, though, which is super interesting, is that it includes maps. And what I mean by this is it includes topographical maps, where 2 things that are close together in the brain are similarly close together in the body. So there's a motor area where if you were to shock parts of that brain, parts of the body would twitch accordingly. And just like you'd expect, the middle finger is close to the thumb, which is close to the elbow. If it's close in the real world on your body, it's close to the brain. And there's a primary somatosensory area, which is sense organs. And there, if you have somebody in an operating table and you shocked people, they would experience things. They might experience a sound or a flash of light or a touch. And in fact, in the occipital lobe, you have a map for vision, and in the temporal lobe, you have a map for sound. What's really cool is, I said the map is topographical, but the size of the brain areas don't correspond to the size of the actual body areas, but rather to the extent to which there's motor or sensory function. So artists have drawn pictures of people if their body was proportional to the extent that their brain was. And you can see they have the trunk of the body is relatively small, but the hands are enormous. The face is enormous because there's a whole lot of sensation. There's much more sensation going on in your hand than in your whole back, even though the back is physically larger. So part of the cortex is these projection areas, but less than a quarter of the cortex contains projection areas. As I said, the rest is involved with the cool stuff, with language, with reasoning, moral thoughts, and so on. And then the question comes in, how do we know this? How do we know what parts of the brain do what, what parts of the brain are involved, and why? And there's different answers. So one answer is you can scan the brain. You use MRI, which is a high-frequency magnetic field, to look at the activity of the brain, what parts are active and people do different things. We can also look at, so-called natural experiments, when people have tumors or strokes or motorcycle accidents and damage part of their brain, and we can ask the question, what damage to which parts of the brain correspond to damage to which functions? Through these different methods, we've learned about the different parts of the brain and what they do. And we could talk about some certain specific things that can go wrong due to brain damage or stroke or trauma. So for instance, there's apraxia. And apraxia is problems with actions. So you're unable to do an action like waving goodbye or picking up a fork and bringing some food to your mouth. You're not paralyzed. You can make the movements if you have to, but you can't coordinate these basic movements into complex actions. There's agnosia. Agnosias are disorders of perception. And they're not like you can't see, but you can't recognize. Sometimes called psychic blindness. People with various forms of agnosia can describe a picture in terms of its part, but can't recognize the objects that are being depicted. And that's sort of a form of visual agnosia. There's also a specific prosopagnosia, where you can't recognize faces. Oliver Sacks wrote a wonderful book many years ago called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Cat. This was a series of profiles of people who had surprising neurological disorders, and the case that the title case of the book was a man who actually had such an inability to recognize faces, he couldn't distinguish his wife's face from that of a hat. Milder forms of prosopagnosia, which some people suffer from, and to be honest, I got a little bit of some terrible with faces, is that you could recognize faces as faces, but you can't recognize whose face they are, and it's very hard for you to recognize people. There's problems of sensory neglect. You get disorders that kind of block out one part of the world. You might have damage to parts of your brain that would block out the left side of the world. And it's not just a sort of physical thing. When you ask somebody with such a disorder to draw a clock, for instance, they'll put all the numbers from 1 to 12 on the right side of the clock. It's as if they don't think of the left side of the world again. So maybe it's not even a sensory problem, but an attentional problem. There's aphasia, which refers to disorders of language. Some forms of aphasia are expressive, like a Broca's aphasia, where you can't really speak. A famous case of somebody who could only use the word tan, would say tan, 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 but couldn't say anything else. Or then there's sometimes called receptive aphasia, where you can speak, although what you say doesn't make much sense, but also you have a terrible time understanding other people. Then there's all sorts of other disorders. There's the disorder which we talked about with regard to Phineas Gage and various forms of it, where damage to parts of your brain, and it's debatable whether this is true of Phineas Gage, but there are other cases where it's much more clear. It can cause you to lose your moral sense, your sense of right and wrong, your ability to control yourself, to restrain yourself, perhaps your conscience. Now, we're going to talk about all of these things through the course, but the moral here is that A, there's some localization of function, there's some sense in which these correspond to different brain areas, and B, again, this is an argument against dualism. We can see that in that anyone who argued that the mind isn't the brain would be hard-pressed to explain the damage to the brain affects some very intimate and very important aspects of ourselves. We've talked now about the parts of the brain, a little bit about what the different parts do. And let's end by talking about the brain as a whole. So if you just look at the brain, if you remove it from somebody's head and put it on your table, it looks symmetrical, but it's actually not. And so this final topic is about what's called lateralization, which is about the difference between the two halves of the brain, the right half and the left half. It's long been known that there's a difference between right and left. We're not symmetrical creatures. Most people are right-handed, meaning that they do a lot of their motor control and they're most fluid and capable, like right handwriting with their right hand. And a minority of people are left-handed. And then some people are evenly mixed, ambidextrous, right and left. People who are right-handed, for the most part, have language in the left half of their brain. And people who are left-handed are more evenly mixed. Some people have in the right side of their brain, others in the left side of their brain. So the cool thing is that most functions of your brain are duplicated. So a lot of times when you hear somebody say, oh, the right side of the brain, the left side of the brain, and right-brained and left-brained, a lot of what people say about that is total nonsense. Most of the functions of the brain are on both sides, and to a large extent it's sort of more of an issue of dominance or greater potential in one side than another than an absolute difference. But as you know, as the sort of common wisdom goes, the left brain is more associated with written language and spoken language, with reasoning and logic and science, and the right brain is more associated with insight and imagination and music. So we have these two halves of the brain, and normally they're in coordination, but they deal with the world in different ways. So one thing worth noting in any discussion of the halves of the brain is that it works on a principle of contralateral organization. It's an awful technical term, but what it means is that your right brain sees the left side of the world, the left visual field, and the left brain sees the right side of the world. It just works out that the brain has this crossover effect where each half of the brain is looking towards the opposite half of the world. And similarly for motor control, your right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, your left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. Now, you might say, well, this is ridiculous because I'm one person. I'm not two people. I can understand language and appreciate art. I see the world as a coherent scene. I don't see the world with half of me and see the other half of the world with the other half of me. But that's because the two halves of the brain are in constant, immediate conversation. It's through the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is a network of neurons that connect one half of the brain with the other half. And this is what allows sensory information that's received on the left side of the brain, for instance, to be